You ever wondered what generations are there outside of the millennials and the zoomer generations? Who are they? What do they do? What are their attitudes and when do they live? In this video, we will explore all of those generations to answer your questions. From the lost generation who can't find their way back home from World War I to the pixelated minds of the Alpha generation. Welcome back to the Base Indonesian show, where we make all sorts of scuff socio-political commentary on everything. Earth has a very long history. Longer than the À la recherche du temps perdu, which is supposedly the longest book in the world. With a very long history, of course, there's bound to be plenty of people. But what about the social climates, attitude, and behavior of those people? That is what's called a social generation. A generation refers to all of the people born and living at about the same time, regarded collectively. It can also be described as the average period generally considered to be about 20 to 30 years during which children are born and grow up, become adults, and begin to have children. In kinship terminology, it is a structural term designating the parent-child relationship. It is known as biogenesis, reproduction, or procreation in the biological science. But enough about the scientific mumbo-jumbo. We are here for simple explanations. While there are possibly thousands of generations of humans, there is only 8 recorded generations in history, beginning in 1880s. So let's start with the first social generation, which is the lost generation. This is the generation most known for ragtime, cool mustaches, and women's suffrage. The lost generation lived in more simpler times, where the word gay used to mean that you're happy. The lost generation was born between the late 1880s to the early 1900s. Some tried to make it even more accurate and claim the generation was born between 1883 to 1900s. The lost generation truly lived in a very optimistic world. The Industrial Revolution was at its heyday, creating many contraptions that replaced men and women. Colonies and trades opened up the gateway to globalization. Rockefellers and Carnegies were building the blocks for the future. And parents were concerned that kids spent more time reading inappropriate novels like Alice in Wonderland than socializing. Somehow all of that sounds really familiar. The lost generation was raised at the peak of the Industrial Revolution. They were acquainted with technology and a higher standard of living. But most importantly, they were literate, which is why they read a lot. And being literate was a huge thing in human society back then. Back then, it was seen as a luxury to even be able to read your name. It was a time when mass media played on the intuition of people. People knew how to read, but they didn't know how to manage the information they acquired. So people became malleable to extreme contents, much like the Gen Zs. With the Industrial Revolution on full swing, globalization is beginning, and being quite educated, the lost generation were brimming with optimism of a brighter future, which is reflected in the rise of an art movement called Futurism, which emphasized speed, dynamics, youth, violence, and technology, much like mass media today. Life was about to be an adventure and things were going great for all of them. Until... World War I began in 1914, and Philomena Kunk described it best as a wave of trends started because one guy got shot, and now everybody wants to get shot. World War I was fueled by the optimism of the lost generation, who believed that the war would be an adventure. People back then were still very socially conservative and saw warfare as something glorious and were fighting for tooth and nail. It didn't help that the last time there was war in Europe was in the 1850s, when the British and French fought against the Russians in Crimea. What they didn't realize was that with the Industrial Revolution being able to produce weapons, that takes out people en masse. They were in for a shit show. World War I was a bloodbath. Trenches were slogged with dead bodies, rats and disease, manned by people who barely showered for months, painfully waiting for days before their officers blew their whistle to mount a fatal charge on enemy machine guns. And if not machine guns, sometimes the charges are halted by mustard gas, a type of nerve gas that completely kills you by blowing up your nerves. There were literal mountains of bodies after the fighting was done, and this was when tanks and flamethrowers were invented to clear out the trenches from people. People expected battles to be fought in open terrain with lines of infantry charging. But the bolt action rifle and machine guns decimated the battlefield, putting an end to line battle. The conflict itself killed 8 million people overall, which was relatively small compared to World War II, but the fighting was absolutely brutal and inhumane, even more so than its sequel. All of this was perpetrated by the power of industry that mass produced weapons to kill off people in slews and propaganda that encouraged people to be frenzied against the enemy. The brutality and unforgiving nature of World War I traumatized the entire generation and killed them off spiritually. So much so that none of them are willing to envision the future. The generation became so dazed by World War I and the subsequent economical hardships that many succumbed to hedonism. It was from this that Ernest Hemingway, a famous American writer who has managed to fulfill the dreams of Americans retiring in France, said in his book, The Sun Also Rises, that you are all a lost generation. The 1920s was when most of the lost generation had reached adulthood or the age of 20. It was a period characterized by two things: parties and parties. The lost generation was quite directionless, but at least they knew what to do. All they can do is party till their gut busted and just look at the movies like Amsterdam and The Great Gatsby. Everybody's always partying. Or rally in the party like in the Triumph of the Will. They introduced a lot of things that would become mainstays in the world. For example, they introduced the concept of partying like there is no tomorrow, and also partying so hard they take over the government. The lost generation might be lost, but they sure know how to party. Party is the only thing that makes them forget the horrors of World War I. Many in the lost generation felt disillusioned by society. There is a general feeling of loss as if though the world they were raised in no longer existed, and the values they held led them to an early grave. The lost generation shambled through the post-war world trying to find meaning and value in a world so terribly changed. Many filled this void by senseless hedonism, which was made easier with the economy booming again in the early 1920s. At the same time, many others tried filling this void by embracing radical political philosophies. People become critical of social institutions, calling to replace these institutions with alternative ideologies like communism and later on, fascism. Some have found meaning in expression. Literature and art flourish from the likes of F. Scott Fitzgerald, T.S. Eliot, and Gertrude Stein. Modernism was created by the lost generation. In the end, though, what makes them all the same is that the lost generation is a generation that was traumatized by the horrors of industrialized warfare, seeing firsthand how technological advancements of the previous century can be used to slaughter people on a massive scale, and how media and information can be used against them to push them into a senseless war. The lost generation lost all faith in what the world could be when they were younger, and they only found meaning in all of this by embracing the world for what it was, and to mold newer values from the experience they felt about warfare, society, industry, environment, technology, setting down the foundational blocks of how generations to come will perceive these issues. The lost generation might have been lost, but in that aimless wonder, they have set the precedence of how other generations think and feel. It's important to note that while the lost generation as a whole shared some common attitudes and experience, individual experiences and perspectives varied widely. The term lost generation is a broad characterization and does not capture the full complexity of the individuals who belong to this generation. Let me know what you think of the lost generation. Share your thoughts down below. Don't forget to like and subscribe if you want to support this channel, and I will see you in the next video where we discuss about the greatest generation. Bye-bye!
Subscribe to the Based Indonesian Show. Dijamin halal